Okay, thanks very much, everybody. Apologies for starting a little bit later, but we're in time, Amber. Yes, excellent. Okay, welcome to today's Audit Committee meeting. This is not a public meeting, but a meeting the public can attend. I'm Councillor Glenn Bluff, Vice Chair of the Audit Committee, chairing the meeting today. Before I commence, I'd like to outline the domestic arrangements for the meeting. We are not expecting a fire practice today. If the alarm sounds, please leave the chamber, then turn right and proceed down the stairway and through the emergency exit on the ground floor. Basically, just look for me running out. The assembly point is in the public square in front of Cast beyond the fountain. I'm sure you'll see everybody there. Anybody with a mobility issue should wait in the refuge area near the lift and use the intercom to call for assistance. I'll carry you down, Iris, if you want.
I don't need assistance now.
This meeting will be recorded and published on the Council's website. By entering the Council chamber, you are accepting that you will be recorded and your images will be retained and broadcast by the Council. If anyone intends to record today's meeting, please ensure that this does not disturb the conduct of the meeting. Please ensure that your mobile phones are switched to silent, which mine is. And thank you. I will now commence the meeting. On to item 1, apologies for absence. So I've got apologies from the Chair, Austin White. We wish him best in his recovery. And Councillor John Healy and Dr. Stuart Green. Are there any other apologies? No. Okay, thank you. Item 2, exclusion of the public and press. There are no items on the agenda where the public and press are to be excluded. Is that agreed? Yes. Okay. Item 3, declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? No. Excellent. Okay. If there are, please complete the declarations form and forward it to Governance Services. Item 4, minutes of the Audit Committee held on the 25th of April. Have you all had a chance to have a look through them? Can the minutes be moved as a true and accurate record? Thank you. Is that seconded? Yes. Yeah, thank you, Iris. Yes. Okay, item 5, Audit Committee Action Log. As all members have read the report, can I ask Peter Jackson, the Head of Internal Audit, if he wishes to bring any specific issues to members' attention or has anything to add since the report was drafted? Peter.
Thank you, Chair. So there's nothing for me to update in terms of the action log, Chair. Just to note that one item on it was the all-member training on the high-need block DSG position raised by this audit committee at its February and April meeting, picking up on Grant Thornton's annual report and the concerns there. So hopefully, I think yourself, Chair, attended that meeting. Hopefully that discharged that particular item.
Does any member wish to speak on the audit log? So can I just say that I thought that training was very good. I think everybody enjoyed the training. It was good to bring all members up to date of where we are with DSG. Obviously, it is a concern for everybody, and I think it was good to make sure that all members now understand it. So thank you very much for the training. I thought it was very good. Okay, thank you. I will now read out the recommendations within the report. The Audit Committee is asked to note the progress being made against the actions agreed at the previous committee meetings. Is that moved? And seconded? All agreed. Excellent, okay. Oh, good. Item 6, Covert Surveillance, Regulation of Investigative Powers Act. As all members have read the report, can I ask Helen Potts, Principal Legal Officer, if she wishes to bring any specific issues to members' attention or has anything added to the report since it was drafted? Thank you. Helen.
Nothing to add, no.
Brilliant. This is a nice, easy morning. Anything any members wish to add?
Yeah, just a question here. Just to ask really, why have there been no authorisations being sought in this period?
It's generally trading standards who use covert surveillance, but it is an option of last resort, and they have, the question has been asked of them, and they've just used other methods. I think the report specifically references the sniffer dogs, and for the moment they are finding other ways of investigating, particularly illicit alcohol and tobacco. So if they need to, they will use covert surveillance, but it's the last option. And we continue to have the online training, and we also do training face-to-face or online with the specific enforcement and trading standards teams. So they are all aware of covert surveillance and their powers and the responsibilities, but at the moment they are finding other methods for the work that they're doing.
Okay, and there's no sort of evidence or indication that that's to the detriment, and you know, we're not seeing it as it's too difficult to go for the rippers, are we, and falling back on something else and then falling short. I suspect I know the answer, but I just, you know, thought I would ask.
I understand from trading standards that they know that they've got Ripper as an option for them, the covert surveillance, but at the moment they don't need it because the work they're doing, they're finding other routes, and it's been successful for the work they're doing, but it is always there, so there's nothing to say next year there won't be a different outcome.
Okay, Iris, do you have any further questions?
No, I'm familiar with the Ripper. I am familiar with the Ripper legislation from being on licensing and seeing the results of some of the investigations. So yes, but as long as they're you know, fulfilling what is needed without resorting to covert surveillance, I'm happy with that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I will now read out the recommendation within the report. The committee is asked to 1. Note that the Council has no surveillance applications authorised under RIPA since the last report to the Audit Committee in July 2023. And 2. Note that there are no changes to the proposed Council's RIPA policy and procedure. The last minor amendments were approved by this committee in June 2019 following the Investigative Powers Commissioner's inspection recommendations and most recent inspection on the 14th of April 2022. That made no recommendations for changes. Is that moved? Seconded. All agreed. Okay, thank you. Excellent. On to item 7 now. The climate change governance arrangements. As all members have read the report, can I ask Richard Smith, Head of Sustainability, if he wishes to bring any specific issues to members' attention or has anything to add since the report was drafted? Richard.
Thank you, Chair. The only thing is that I wanted to add was really to emphasise the outcome of the findings from audit, but also the progress that has been made to meet the targets that have been set in the environment and sustainability strategy. Limited assurance is being given, but I hope that the report and the information that's been shared with members also presents a very positive response and approach by the Council in terms of the actions that have been taken, the decisions, the level of priority given by both the Doncaster Mayor, the Chief Executive, Team Doncaster Executive, the South Yorkshire Mayor. So there's a lot of positives to be taken from this, the financial commitment that's been made, and also the progress that's been made against some very aspirational and very scalable challenges that have been presented. So there's a good base now to work from, notwithstanding the aspirational target is very challenging. It doesn't align with the government target. It is accelerated by 10 years against the government target. And therefore, we do hope that new government brings in more legislative powers and support to help us to accelerate our own work, especially in relation to supply chain, finance, and all those critical supply services that will allow us to make progress at the scale that is required. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard. And any questions from Dave?
One from me, thanks, Chair. So obviously there has been slippage on it, and we know that as a result of your report. Can you be a little bit more specific to the committee and just give us you know, a little bit of detail around the issues that you're facing in terms of, you know, what sort of driven that slippage?
When the target is set against a baseline, so we have both a 2030 target for 85% reduction of carbon in Doncaster, both the authority and for the borough, the city, and a net zero target of 2040 against a baseline of 2005 that was set by government. So we have both an internal view and also an external view in terms of our own position for the council and also for the city and the borough. The expectation against the 2005 baseline is that the reduction of carbon will be aligned with around about a 12 to 14% year-on-year reduction. On average, the most recent statistics have been released just actually after the report was submitted. The data at national level for the whole borough comes out every 2 years, and it's 2 years in arrears. So we've got 2022 data now that shows around about a 39% reduction of carbon emissions against the 2005 baseline. So that now requires around about a 15 to 16% year-on-year saving reduction in carbon emissions. So the slippage, you should say, is we started monitoring this position and following the declaration of the climate and biodiversity emergency in 2019, if we take COVID, Brexit and other issues out of the way in terms of 2020 not being a great deal of movement in 2020. In 2021, we published our strategy, which set out that very ambitious target for 2030 and 2040. And then we formed and took decisions with financial support to create a more coordinated approach to delivering ambition through the creation of the Sustainability Unit, which I head up. So the progress that has been made on average is more around about a 2 to 3% reduction year on year across that period. What we need to consider also is our target is against something called Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And in simple terms, what they are is the production and the processing of fossil fuels and water. So it's our gas, our electricity, our transport fuels that are either produced and combusted elsewhere or produced and combusted at the source where we use them. So that is what we're being monitored against in terms of our reduction. There's also something called Scope 3 emissions that are considered, which are things that are more outside of our control, things that we can influence, but it's more associated with our supply chain, so the things that we consume as a result of others producing. So our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are the target for reduction. And as a council, we still have an opportunity to meet our targets for 2030 and 2040, because some of this is within our own control, some of it is out of our control, but we've made commitments to reduce fuel consumption as a result of our fleet replacement program. We've got over 650 vehicles in the council's ownership, and we've got just over 50 vehicles now that are full battery electric, which have the opportunity to be zero emissions at the tailpipe. We're moving towards the electrical supply for the council. There could be opportunities to buy a locally generated supply, but the emissions and the carbon factors are actually reducing at a national level because of a decrease in use of coal and gas, and an increase, especially in the coming years, will be around nuclear, wind and solar and hydro. So there are things that we can do and take decisions to reduce consumption at the source by changing our fleet, by reducing consumption in our buildings through energy efficiency changes and building fabric changes, but also through the fuel that we use. So there's opportunities that are coming at a national level, but also at a local level, that could allow the council to meet our 85% reduction target by 2030. But it's going to take an awful lot of effort. And just we've got 6 years to go. If we were given the money tomorrow, we couldn't then deliver by the end of the year because the supply chain just isn't in place. So everyone's fighting for the same supply chain, the same resource, both in terms of skills and capacity. So there is a huge challenge, but there are things that will work for us, as well as working against us, that will allow us to meet that target. The wider borough challenge is much more challenging, because where we don't have that level of control, we need to get ourselves in a best position to be able to apply powers of influence, because the council's own emissions account for less than 2% of carbon emissions in Doncaster, yet our scope of influence could be 20%, 30%, 40%, who knows, if we can lead by example. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good overview. Thank you. I mean, I wonder how, and you may not know this. It's just a thought that sort of comes to mind is what the impact on those targets are, and how they might be recalculated. For example, as a growing borough, we're increasing population, increasing a desire to increase internal tourism. Obviously, the airport. I understand, if I'm technically correct, that aircraft emissions are outside of the scope, but I guess journeys to and from and the impact on the ground is taken into scope as well. Is that kind of calculated through? So are we on like a sliding scale? Are we started where we've started and no amount of growth, however it happens, affects that target, or is there an ongoing calculation that says, well, actually the population has just grown by I have no idea 10,000, for example, and therefore that's kind of factored in? Is there any of that, or are we stuck with it, or are we stuck with what we've got? And if we double the size of our sort of population, we would still be aiming at that target. Is that coherent?
Yes, Councillor Shaw, I understand. When the national data is produced by government, it considers growth. So it's not just a position that we took in 2019-20 versus the 2005 position. So that baseline will change along with the decrease or increase in carbon emissions. So it does consider growth and change. And there is a huge challenge there around growth versus sustainability, because the economy drives everything that we do. So while climate and net zero challenges are a priority, it is one of many priorities that are competing against others that could hinder our pathway to achieving these targets. Other things that we need to see change in terms of that gives us greater control locally is improvement on building standards and developments, and how they consider the natural environment as well as the quality of the build and the standard and the longevity of the build, along with the levels of and types of fuel that they will consume in the future. So there are some things that we need to be given increased powers to have greater control of, rather than allowing standards to be met at are now seen to be outdated, that will worsen the position for us. So and as a society, we consume a lot more than we used to, and as you said, there were more people, and the area is growing. So consumption is a huge challenge that we need to consider, both in terms of transport fuel, heating and lighting our homes and businesses, but also the material goods that we consume. So there's a lot that take into consideration there. And I think in terms of the transition around how those services and goods are produced, there's also pressure on those organisations and those businesses to make those reduced carbon emissions and eventually zero emissions. Some of that will come as a result of the processing. Some of the reduction in carbon will come as a result of offsetting, improvements to nature, growing trees, carbon sinks, etc.
If I could, I just wanted to respond to that point about the wider challenge, and I think Richard's elaborated it very well. The biggest challenge for us is the wider city, because our own organisation is our own organisation, which is subject to our direction and our influence. But we do need to set the tone very clearly with our stewardship role. The other challenge that we've got is competing priorities. So just to give you a very practical example, for housing, there is an extreme demand currently for housing, but you want housing, particularly housing that the authority may build, to be of a high sustainability standard. With that comes increased costs. With increased costs comes lesser units. Lesser units doesn't necessarily match your demand. So I think there's a need to consider that some things don't necessarily immediately reconcile. I think what we can demonstrate as an authority is a significant commitment to addressing the climate emergency. We have a dedicated sustainability unit. We have a reserve within there. And what we're also looking at now in terms of the governance piece, if you remember, a lot of authorities did this some years ago in terms of climate neutrality and reducing carbon emissions. And the momentum wasn't necessarily maintained until more recently. What we're doing with the partners is moving away from that traditional approach of kind of saying to them, well, what are you doing? Because they'll all have, the big partners, both private and public, will have generally their own strategies for addressing this kind of thing. What I think we need to do is move towards a position where we are coalescing around particular initiatives to drive that incentive and to drive that interest. And I think that's what we're finding now, is that we can sit around a table with NHS partners, we can sit around a table with big business, and they'll all tell us what they're doing. But what we need to do is get them collectively and collaboratively and cohesively working with us about what can be done to assist. And then that can bleed into other things like transport planning, like housing, like green space, like energy provision. And what is interesting, and what will be interesting to see, now we have a Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero, to see what comes out of central government to assist us with this. Because I think there has been previously some elements of different types of funding streams for very similar purposes, but not necessarily administered in a coordinated way. And that's been a bit of a stretch. And going back to what Richard said as well, the market is a challenge for us because it's something that everybody's trying to do. And I think housing retrofit has been quite an example of that you've got lots of people doing it. And I also think that there's a longer term issue here to think about the role within the sub-region and what the MCA has to play in this, particularly around some of those big ticket drivers that impact on the environment, like growth, like transport, and like housing.
I mean, this really is the drive of my question. You will understand I probably do, kind of dig into this area quite a lot, and I understand the challenges, and I see it as a kind of, in some ways, in a bit of an impossible task, where growth is absolutely directly opposing to reducing carbon emissions. We might be able to sort of take a house unit and say, well, previously that house would have been responsible for the emissions of X amount of carbon, and now that unit we can build out and it will only be X amount of carbon, but we've still got that extra because we're looking at growth. So I see I guess I see the impossibility in some senses of how strong the competing things are. I guess it's looking toward, we really have to look towards what the new government are going to provide for us, and how we can possibly work with house builders to start reducing that, because I think there's not a great deal of drive, as far as I'm aware, for them to put up the unit costs, as you've said, Dan. That kind of becomes self-defeating on the affordable home side, doesn't it? So I guess it's not really a question, more an observation and an acknowledgement that you've probably got, as it stands at the minute, with what we've got at our disposal, probably a pretty impossible task. So it's just an acknowledgement of that, really. So that's it for me, Chair. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Bear in mind I haven't been on this committee for a long time, but my thought is you're trying to calculate sort of people's consumption of how much they're turning out into the atmosphere and all the rest of it. But a lot of stuff is made in China these days. In fact, I try to buy things that are not made in China, which is sometimes impossible. Can we tell anyway? I mean, that they're making the pollution, we're just using it. Is there any way that we calculate of that sort of thing? With all the stuff that comes in containers, and particularly clothes. I mean, they're everywhere if you look on the net and that. I mean, we're consuming, but we're not consuming, if you see what I mean. Is there any way you get any sort of idea of where that places things?
Thanks, Councillor Beach. We don't have the figures for Doncaster, but there are companies, currently a number of companies competing for the business of local authorities, for government, for private sector organisations to identify what are referred to as Scope 3 emissions. So the emissions I described earlier, Scope 1 and Scope 2, are more under our direct control in terms of levels of consumption. Whereas Scope 3, we are at the mercy of, okay, where do we buy things from and what process has been undertaken to produce them and transport them. and then how are they recycled and disposed of. So there's a whole life cycle around the issue that you're raising there of Scope 3 emissions. So it's not something that we are directly monitoring yet, but something that we will absolutely need to monitor in the future. Now, our procurement approach and the approach of many people, not all people, we look for opportunities where things are produced and can be bought local, and things that are they're able to, once they've been used, they can be used again, or they can go through a proper recycling and disposal process. But it's fair to say the vast majority of what we consume is not. This could be applied to materials that we use and products and services, as well as our food and supply chain around food. So there's a huge challenge around that area, but it is something that we will need to monitor in the future, because once we've considered our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, our Scope 3 emissions will need to be considered. They're not being ignored, they are being considered now. But again, there's part of this that comes back to the growth versus sustainability, what's affordable, what can be used, what's within budget. So there are products and services, just like buying from a local farmer's market. It'll probably cost you a little bit more and not everybody can afford it. There are goods and services that we could buy that don't necessarily meet our budget, so we might have to buy something at a lower specification. Of course, in terms of our delivery as local authority, we always look to meet best practice. So we are looking for that best quality service and goods, but not everybody can afford that. So again, there's that balance of, okay, what can we afford versus its sustainability credentials, and at what point are we ever going to be less reliant on importing goods that are more carbon intensive?
Thanks very much. Thanks, Councillor Beach. I thought that was an excellent question. Just a question from me, just regarding the Scope 3 emissions, which I think are very interesting. The actions that are in here, especially around the risk register and the risk assessments that are being done, can we expect to see that will include what's happening around Scope 3 for us to understand the risk assessments around that more?
Yes, Councillor Buff, that is an area that we are going to be exploring. And when we look at, there's a risk assessment now for the council, for the sustainability unit, and also for the borough that's going to be forthcoming, and that's one of the final actions that are going to be undertaken to close down this audit. So there's going to be a need to understand what those Scope 3 emissions are, to help people understand what are the impacts from their supply chain, because there's data and monitoring and information that's available directly to those consumers about Scope 1 and Scope 2. The Scope 3 is quite a minefield, because when you think about, okay, I'm going to buy a TV from the other side of the world, then what are the emissions associated with that, and at what point are they going to reduce? And so there's a whole life cycle around the production, the purchase, the transportation, the disposal. So it's things that we need to understand, and the more legislative powers that are introduced and presented to private supply chain, the better for us, because there will be more monitoring and more evaluation of those products and services to a point where we can understand what we're buying and what the impact is. So you've started to see that transition and some of those changes where you can see what the consumption is of a certain product, whether it be a white appliance or whether it be another electrical appliance, in terms of an A to G rating. But it needs to get much more advanced from that, so you can see, okay, what are the materials that have been used and where they come from. And of course, the auditing and evaluation of that is going to be extremely difficult at the source, all the way through to the transport, all the way through to the use and then the disposal of that product. So it's a huge grey area that certainly needs to be explored, because Scope 3 is highly likely to count for the vast majority of the emissions globally.
Thanks very much. Dave, did you want to come back?
Yeah, just, these conversations spark, words are said, aren't they? And it kind of sparks a kind of line of questioning, really. And I think it's appropriate, but tell me if not. So the word recycling was used, and obviously we are in the midst of a information sharing or a public awareness raising, or however we want to put it, in terms of what people can and cannot recycle in their bins. I think we've done a good job of it, but I don't think it's gone well, if that makes sense. I don't think it's been well received in terms of how we're perceived and the level of levels of items or the types of items we can recycle. I do have a basic understanding of, you know, kind of the industry and the deviating prices and the demand around the world and what's changed since COVID and China and you know the places where this product might go. It would just be interesting though to if you can. I mean, if you can't, because I appreciate I'm kind of putting you on the spot, and it might not be you, Richard, but to give just a little bit of an insight into the challenges of when a member of the public sees recyclable on an item, why that can't go in the blue bins. Because the other thing that's coming back, sorry, excuse me, loud and clear, and I'm not sure whether it's true or not, is that other authorities recycle a lot more than we do. Now, I'm not sure that is the case, that's the assertion, but I don't know that for a fact, because we are all within the global market in terms of recycling. So if you can, it would be really useful if you can just sort of give a bit of a view on that area.
If I could, Chair, I think it's probably more relevant for me as the chap within the authority that manages the relationship with Suez, who is our waste collector. So just to give it some context, you talked about us in performance in terms of overall recycling targets. My advice would be have a look at our figures and have a look at some of the authorities, because I think we perform reasonably well in the global picture in terms of recycling. But we are below our own target, I'll admit that. But if you look at some others, you know, I was looking recently to a comparable authority, and we're at about 42% and they're at about 35%. So I think we're on and around the average within the industry. However, what you've alluded to is the more recent complications with waste collection and disposal. So what is apparent is our contractual relationship has a target figure for the amount of contamination, and that's where people put, and I'll come back to this point in a second, people put the wrong thing in the wrong bin. If that percentage is higher, that can have financial implications for the authority, because as you know, waste that goes in a bin has to go somewhere. If it goes somewhere and it's not the correct kind of waste, it needs separating and then may need to go somewhere else. What is apparent is that the type and nature of recyclates that can go in particular bins can be quite easily and innocently misunderstood. So, and I'm not going to get into the technicals of this because I'm not so sure I'm the best person to explain some of the technical stuff, but if I do it very practically, you may assume that a margarine tub could go in a particular type of bin, but it can't. So that's where we've had to do some education. I think there was some learning about that education in advance, because I think people did quite legitimately get frustrated that they did what they thought was a legitimate action to support recycling, but then found that they got a bin that had not been collected because there's a tag on it. It is opportune for us because we are coming up to a stage with the contract with Suez where we can look at the arrangements for what goes in the bins and then where it goes from there, to make that as simple as possible for our customers to recycle. We've also got to think about the wider position in terms of national and legislation around waste regulations. But I think there has been some learning, but I just want to set it in context that there is a contractual obligation to maintain a low level of contamination. And I think what that has identified is that we need to think about the most practical and simple solution to help people put the right things in the right bin to prevent it going forward. That may not be without some element of cost to the authority when we come to looking at the contractual position, either with Suez or when we go out to market.
Thanks for that. I think obviously it's a broad overview. There are other sort of things that play into this, which just as a sort of reference point really is that as an area that's got probably quite a relatively transient community within it, you know, we have a policy where we don't take the bins away, and I have literally, you know, at times hundreds of blue bins that are sat for weeks and weeks on end on the streets in my ward, and I'm sure it's not the only ward. So I don't think it's for now, but I think it's something that I would like to look at and talk about in terms of how long we leave those bins there, and when we lift them and why we lift them. But I think it's not for now. It's something I'd like to talk about. But Chair, it is something that I would quite like to bring as an item in itself back to committee to discuss in more depth. You know, so you know, a deeper understanding of the, you know, the industry as it stands for recyclable items, and why some things say they can be recycled and they can't, and just a little bit. But I think you need the opportunity to go away and kind of prepare for that rather than put you on the spot now. So,
sorry, Dan.
I'm conscious this is audit committee, and we do have a scrutiny function. My best professional advice would be that the element of considering waste recyclers, recycling behaviour, could be something that would be relevant to a scrutiny committee within its terms of reference. You know, audit traditionally would deal with governance and risk. I'm not aware of particular risks that have been identified in relation to performance of the waste contract. We empty bins at a very high rate. Now, I concede that there have been some learning points recently with recyclers and what goes in, but we've done a piece of work to educate, and what we are saying is that in future we need to look at making it as simple as possible so that people don't make innocent mistakes, because we don't want bins to not be collected. However, what we don't want to do is collect bins that are contrary to a contractual arrangement that cost us money, because it's got to be balanced. So going forward, I think we've got an opportunity, but my best professional advice would be, I think this is probably something for a scrutiny committee to consider, and we have been having engagement about the future arrangements for waste, because the contract runs until 2026, and we've got to look at what we're going to do next. So that's my personal view. I'm not aware of particular risks associated with the delivery of our waste collection and waste disposal process. And just going back to the point you raised about recycling, we do have 6 household waste recycling centres, which is higher than our neighbours.
I think if I may just jump in, I think the risks are that we impact on hitting our targets. That's where I would associate the risk. But I take, you know, I'll allow the more learned people to make the decision on whether it's suitable for audit, but I don't accept that there's not a risk that might need to be looked at in terms of audit. But I will leave that with the chair and the other people in the room to make that decision. But I do think there's a risk there, and I think it is about hitting targets. But I'll leave that to others.
Thanks, Dave. I think from what you were saying, Dan, it's probably more suitable for scrutiny at this stage, unless risks were to come out from the report, for example, and from scrutiny. We've got about 5 minutes, I think, available on this topic, Iris, if you had one more question. Yeah.
Well, it's actually a bit of clarification. When recycling first started getting, going, I was chair of a committee in Redditch and Worcestershire, which was Public and Environmental Services. And one thing that came up with sorting what was the little sign on it, we always said, and what I want to know is it still relevant, that if it had got a 1, a 2 or a 5 in it, you could recycle them. It's because they were like pop bottles. And they used to have a black piece round, if you remember, a strength, and you couldn't recycle them. But once you took that black off, you could. So does this sort of grading of what is recyclable, does it still stand? Is it different?
There are gradings in relation to certain types of recyclers. What I think is best for me to explain to you, and I can provide this separately, is what can and cannot go in our bins, because that's where the confusion has been from our residents. And I think the residents have expressed quite rightly some legitimate confusion, because they've put in what they thought was recyclable in a recyclable bin, a margarine tub, and then they found that it's been contaminated. So we've got quite express information on our webpage, and I know not everybody uses that, about what can and cannot go in the bins. But also what we did do for those areas that were within the rounds of bins being checked for contamination, we wrote out in advance to residents, and we provided quite a simple letter to explain what can and can't go into the bins to prevent that innocent mistake. I mean, we do get some people who put things in bins that shouldn't go in bins, that's the reality. But what we don't want to do is penalise people who are legitimately and innocently making a mistake because they thought that they could put something in a particular type of bin. So I can share one of those letters with you and also point you in direction of the web stuff.
The biggest thing is those plastic tubs you get biscuits and tomatoes and stuff in. Those are the worst offenders, aren't they? Because they do say they're recyclable, but I mean, I had to stop my neighbour putting them in.
Yeah.
They
Yes,
are a very big offender, and there's a hell of a lot of them.
Yeah, I think if I could, Chair, what I would want to stress very, very, very strongly is we want to provide the easiest and simplest way of doing things that prevents a legitimate mistake being made that leads to non-deliberate contamination. And I think we've got an opportunity around that, but that does mean some technical changes to the waste stream and the disposal arrangements, which we're currently in dialogue with, and that will form part of any future contract arrangements when we come for a renewal.
Thanks very much, Dan. I thought that was a good conclusion at the end. I know there are other options, and I think it's maybe a topic for scrutiny. I have a separate bin myself. I pay for a private collection because 100% gets recycled. It's manually sorted. Obviously, that's very intensive, but I think it's good value for money to get it all recycled. Excellent. Well, I'll now read out the recommendation for the report. So the committee is asked to note the contents of report. Is that moved? Yes. And seconded? Yep, agreed. Good. Moving on to item 8. So that recommendation is noted. Item 8, Audit Committee Prospectus, Terms and Reference of the Work Programme for 2024-25. As all members have read the report, can I ask Peter Jackson, Head of Internal Audit, if he wishes to bring any specific issues to members' attention or has anything to add since the report was drafted? Peter.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just provide a very, very quick summary of the report. It's essentially split into 3 parts. In terms of reference for the Audit Committee, there were some very minor changes put through at Annual Council in May earlier on this year. They're very largely unchanged, though, from they were in 2023. We've got a prospectus in there. That again has got minimal wording changes similar to the terms of reference, and the prospectus does reflect the 2022 guidance for audit committees from SIPFA, who are our governing body in that respect. The third part of it is the draft work programme, which I've put together. It's hopefully very straightforward. It reflects the, alongside the prospectus, how the committee complies with its terms of reference, and the agenda items picks up the reports in order for it to be able to deliver its objectives. So what I'm really asking for is members to check the work programme covers the areas they're anticipating. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Any questions, members? I think it's very good, thank you, Peter. It's
We've got this this is from Austin to me last night. Could you please seek confirmation from Peter Jackson that the work programme is indicative at this point, and items can be added due to any problems being identified by internal audit, requiring reporting and consideration at future committees?
Yes, happy to confirm that. Obviously, if we get any new or emerging issues during the year that we bring to committee's attention, then we do so, and we'll amend the work programme to reflect that.
Question, Dave?
I think it's a good document. I've been on the committee a little while now, and I do have faith in the in the audit process and what's brought before us. So more than happy to kind of approve the document.
Brilliant, and I've got nothing else to add on that. So if there's no further questions, I'll read out the recommendation for this. The Audit Committee is asked to agree the prospectus setting out of the Audit Committee's scope, standards and work programme for the year, and note the updated terms of reference for the Audit Committee for 2024-25 municipal year. Move? Yes. Seconded? Agreed. Brilliant. Okay, moving on to item 9, internal audit report for the period April 2024 to June 2024. As all members have read the report, can I ask Peter Jackson, Head of Internal Audit, if he wishes to bring any specific issues to members' attention or has anything to add since the report was drafted? Peter.
Thank you, Chair. Just to summarise, it's my usual report, standard report in the usual format. Nothing specifically to update on, but I do want to highlight the entry over the North Bridge stores that's within the report and the measurably better position that we're now in. I'm hopeful that this area can now be off both mine and your radars going forward. In overall terms, I feel it's a positive report and there's no areas of concern that I'm wanting to highlight to you. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Yeah, sorry, Iris, go. No, go, sorry, I didn't realise you.
No, go on, carry on.
It's only a quick one. It's to know. I mean, I'm pleased that that North Bridge is now off the areas of concern. I just wanted to make comment that I honestly don't think it should have taken as long as it did, and that's not down to anything to do with audit. I think it appeared on our papers for too long and too often, and you know, I think I said in one of the meetings, it's not an Amazon distribution centre, so I would hope that that's something that, you know, is in the past, and it's not, you know, that we never really have anything on the books as long as we have something like that. I mean, we will all obviously try and guard against that, I'm sure, but it's just to be noted. I think it went on far too long. Thank you.
Sorry, Iris. Yeah. Councillor Beach.
Thank you. Austin again. Could you ask Peter about the arrangements following the successful recruitment exercise for the new trainee? And also, could you ask a general question over what assurance the Audit Committee can take from this report and the likelihood of this being maintained given previous history? So, I'll leave.
Okay, so by way of update, we had quite a bit of a discussion at April's Audit Committee over the fact that we were taking on a trainee auditor under the apprenticeship scheme. We've now completed the recruitment progress. We have the successful applicant now starting with us in less than a month. We've got a work programme for her all set out, which dovetails in with the approved training programme that she's got to go through with a provider that we're now contracted with. So we've got some very sound arrangements put in place for her, and it is quite an accelerated progression. If she works well and she passes the exams and whatever, it gets her promoted from a trainee auditor to internal auditor within about 15 months' time, and assuming all the progression takes place, she'll be a senior auditor with us within 3 years after having 18 months post-qualification experience. This is the response to the sort of local and national shortage that we've got of internal auditors, and you know, it's hopefully growing our own, sets the sort of tone for the future. Yeah, and we just by way of some numbers, we actually had 43 applicants. We shortlisted down to 8 applicants. One dropped out before the day because she'd got alternate employment, but we had 3 people that were very, very, very appointable. The quality was very, very good. And I would say that the support that we've had from HR on the apprentice side has been really, really helpful. Couldn't have faulted it better, couldn't have faulted it more.
Right, thank you.
Thanks very much, Pete. I am pleased that we are taking on apprentices because I think it's an excellent way for people to get into work. And it's my son's on an apprenticeship. I've got another son who's going forward for one. So it's definitely changed my opinion over the years. And I'm really pleased that we're entering into that as well. Any further questions?
I think we have asked this before, and it's a difficult area just around retention, really. And I think we did talk about not wanting to tie people up in, you know, kind of obligations over a number of years and things like that. But I mean, you know, I'm aware that as a local authority, we while we pay as well as we can, you know, I'm aware that there are, you know, outside of local authorities, the demand is such that, you know, there's a lot more money being offered. You know, how do we retain the staff that we invest in?
Okay, so it's illegal for us to put any sort of financial ties upon an apprentice. That's the national sort of law over it. In terms of what we can do in terms of retaining the employees, we want to create a workplace that they want to actually work in, and I believe that we've got that in the council. It's a good place to work. We're the largest employer in the area. We offer excellent pensions. We have flexible working arrangements, excellent holidays, etc., etc. We've got to be able to offer the progression as well for the trainee for that particular post, and if she passes this level 3 apprenticeship, I'm hoping that she'll be able to go on and do the level 7, which gets her then to be a fully qualified internal auditor. We try and support the rest of our team through developing their existing skills and experience. We create, as I say, that work environment where I hope that they enjoy being here. There is the lure of higher salaries elsewhere in the private sector, but people have got the choices as to, you know, whether they want to go there or not. You know, we have a lot of employees with families, and I think that the work-life balance that we can offer them through our flexible working arrangements are a big pull. I know that is within our team. Is there anything else that you want to cover? Yeah.
To some extent, it depends on the recruitment process and getting the right candidate that can progress, because it's okay, isn't it, offering the opportunity to, but if there's not a desire to or a capability to, then you know, people then get stuck in a place, don't they? But you know, I mean, I know there's limited things that you can do, but it sounds like not that I thought you wouldn't have thought it through, yeah, obviously, but it sounds like we're doing everything that we can. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. Shall I pick up on the other question from Councillor Beach?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So at the moment, I'm anticipating being able to offer a positive opinion of the Council's risk governance and control arrangements, which follows on from my opinion from April, which was my annual opinion. Our work to date hasn't identified any items that we want to consider for inclusion in the next annual governance statement, and we haven't come across any areas of particularly poor control that I'm having to highlight up to you at this point. So I'm in a positive position at this moment in time, but my caveat is that there can always be something around the corner that could upset that, but that will obviously be covered at a future meeting of the Audit Committee.
Just while I think Iris has got another question, but while she's just looking for that, I've just got a couple of questions regarding the overall report. Could you just give us a bit of a verbal summary about the investigations and just an update on those, please?
Because of the actual nature of the work, I can't really go into very much detail at all. We have been involved in 2 items of investigative work that we've identified in this report. One of those was regarding missing equipment and timekeeping arrangements. Those matters have been resolved through the normal council internal processes, and that issue is now done and dusted. That's complete. There's been another issue that's been identified in terms of payments being trying to generated against the council, and that is still ongoing. There is further work to be done on that, and I can't really say anything further on that issue at this moment in time.
Thanks very much, Peter. Could you just give us an update as well regarding the Doncaster audit, because I see that the scope has changed a little bit, and just how that's progressing?
Yeah, what I should also say with regard to those investigations is that we may be able to provide further information in the annual counter fraud report, which should be coming to November's Audit Committee, which is our next committee. With regard to the Doncaster review that's taking place, it is in progress. We haven't offered any formal findings at the moment, so I can't really comment in detail on what's coming out of that. So really it's just basically work in progress. I do anticipate being able to report fully on that issue at November's Audit Committee.
It's to ask Peter if you're happy with the overall position in the area of overdue management actions, and do you feel there's any escalation needed?
As per my report, I am actually happy with the position that we're in. The numbers do appear higher than we've had in some previous quarters, but going back further in time, we're in a very happy place in terms of these numbers. None of the items caused me any concern. There was 6 of those actions that are overdue have been in the area of the climate change governance arrangements, which we covered earlier, and others are in specific parts of the authority, some of which were brought forward from April's Audit Committee, and we had a lot of narrative at that committee explaining the delays that had taken place there. So we're monitoring them tightly, as we always do. I don't have any areas of specific concern, and at this moment in time, no, I'm not in need of any escalation. It has been helpful in the past, but we're nowhere near that sort of position that we have been in.
Okay. Any further questions? Dave? Yes. Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much, Peter. It's good to get these updates. I will now read out the recommendation within the report. If I can turn the page. The committee is asked to note the position of the internal audit plan, the internal audit work completed in the period, the position with regard to the implementation of management actions arising from internal audit recommendations, and the current position regarding the ability to deliver the annual opinion over the Council's risk governance and control arrangements. Is that moved? Agreed. Seconded. Agreed. Okay, the recommendations are noted. Moving on to item 10, unaudited statement of accounts. I saw Rob, thank you very much. As all members have read the report, can I ask Faye Tyas, Service Director for Finance and Technology, if she wishes to bring any specific issues to members' attention or has anything to add since the report is drafted. And you just reminded me of a question I had. Thank you.
Thank you. Nothing to add. Just to thank the team for providing the training. I hope it was useful on the the statement of accounts, the unaudited statement of accounts. So yeah, any open to questions?
Okay. Does any member wish to speak?
I've got a couple of bits, but
no, I'll let you go first.
Right, okay,
yeah.
Thank you. Are there any particular problems or concerns over the production and presentation of these unaudited accounts?
I think it's too early days at the moment. Gareth, do you want to say a little bit in terms of timing?
Yeah. So I think I was going to come in at some point on the timing just to emphasise what I discussed back at the previous meeting when I presented the audit plan. So I think there is a context around the timing of our audit this year that is relevant just to emphasise once again. So as a firm, we've taken the view, and this was when there was an expected backstop to be in place for accounts that were not signed off, dated 22, 23 or earlier. There was an original plan to have a backstop or an amnesty at the end of September. And as a firm, we took the view that we wanted to audit as many accounts as possible, in inverted commas, properly before the 30th of September to reduce that backlog down. Now, there isn't a backlog at Doncaster because we've had a good relationship with Faye and Rob and the team, and we've always signed off sort of within the calendar year, so there's no backlog built up here at Doncaster. But what it did mean is that the Doncaster audit would be more back-ended this year than it previously has been before. And as I say, as a firm, we took that view that it was the right thing to do to try and audit as many accounts as possible in a proper manner to try and get to a position of a clean opinion. Now, Grant Thornton nationally, at the end of May, had audited 65% of all accounts 22, 23 or earlier. The rest of the firms combined in the sector had audited 7%. So, you know, that's the context that we're working in here, notwithstanding the fact that that has put your audit at a later date than it traditionally has been. So, obviously we've got the draft accounts from Faye and Rob. Parminder and I and the team have continued to meet with the finance team on a regular basis, but the vast majority of our work is scheduled in from sort of the end of September through to Christmas. Our ISA 260 is scheduled in for the end of November's audit committee, and we're committed to signing and completing this audit this calendar year, and that's still absolutely you know, our intention. So it's very early days in terms of the audit this year. Traditionally, obviously, we'd have been well underway at this point, but as I say, it's mainly going to be kicking in towards the end of September through the rest of the calendar year. But I just wanted to re-emphasise that context to the timetable here at Doncaster this year. Just more widely, the backstop at the end of September isn't now going to take place because of the calling of the election. There wasn't parliamentary time to put that through. But our discussions with FRC, SIPFA, the NAO, etc., is that the backstop is still likely to come into play, but it may well be the end of December or end of January. So there still will be an amnesty of sorts, because whilst we're trying to make as much progress as we can, as I mentioned, the rest of the sector's not really moving that far forward. So there will still be an amnesty for those councils that would be impacted by it, but you're not part of that issue. So providing this year's audit goes as well as the previous ones we've done, we'll be issuing a clean opinion by Christmas, and therefore there's no ongoing modified or qualified opinions impacting on Doncaster in the future. For a number of councils across the country, they're going to have to probably deal with modified and qualified opinions for the next 3 or 4 years until that works its way through the system, which is still a big issue for the sector as a whole. So I appreciate it's quite a big of a sort of verbal update on that. So, you know, if there are any questions, Chair or other members, obviously happy to take them. Thank you.
I mean, you know, kind of sort of not directly, you know, attached to your reply, but is there anything sort of potentially that, you know, is there any flex in certain areas such as sort of pensions and land and buildings and infrastructure assets and things like that that might impact on the final audit, that there's any unease about, shall we say?
It's a really good question, that, Councillor Short. There could be, and I suppose traditionally those areas, not just at Doncaster but as a whole, tend to be the areas where audit adjustments take place. So there have been in the past here at Doncaster, if you look back at previous ISA 260s, adjustments around valuation of land and buildings or the pension fund balance or asset. I suppose the key point, well, 2 key points on that. One is adjustments in those areas are fairly typical across local authority audits. That's point number 1. And then I suppose from a member point of view, even more important is that any adjustments in those areas would not impact on the usable reserves available to FAIN or MTFS or to you as members in terms of your future budgets. And this then comes back to a separate point that we've discussed here and elsewhere a number of times, is it right that they are the areas of focus for external audit when audit resource is quite scarce and limited? We're focusing our audit attention on areas that ultimately don't impact on, in inverted commas, the bottom line. But whilst our regulators are very interested in the level of audit scrutiny and work in those areas, that they're high value areas subject to a lot of assumptions and changes that can have material issues, auditors will continue to focus in those areas. But as a part of a wider development for the sector, there may well be a move away from some the degree of auditor focus in those big number areas, but don't actually affect the bottom line to more areas that actually do impact on future financial sustainability of authorities. So I suppose what I'm saying is it's too early to say. It's too early to say it. Yeah, no, it's too early to say at the minute. But it's a really good question, Councillor Shaw, in that if there are issues with the audit, they do typically fall into those areas, but they're not areas that are ultimately going to affect the financial position of the council.
Okay, so just to, you know, from my point of view, then just I understand it is, yes, there may be some issues, but in those areas there won't be significant enough to impact the overall audit. So just my follow-on question would, if have I got that correct?
They won't, not quite, Councillor Shaw. They could be significant to affect the audit opinion if there are material issues in those areas which FAE and management are not prepared to adjust for. But because adjustments in those areas don't ultimately affect the financial position of the council, typically the Section 151 officer will agree to adjust any errors in those areas without too many difficult conversations.
Then, is our position is now, I appreciate things can change, are there any signs of any red flags in any of these areas? You know, that we kind of go, we need, you know, we've got to be really aware of that.
I would say not at this stage, but it is very, very early in terms of our audit process. So, and I suppose, you know, if there were any significant issues between now and the end of November's audit committee, where we felt that management weren't responding to accordingly, or we had a particular difference of opinion with management, then we'd bring that to the attention of Councillor White, or in his absence, Councillor Bluff. What I would say is that my previous experience of the 4 years I've dealt with the year end here at Doncaster is that would be highly unlikely, because where there have been issues in the audit, we've discussed and talked them through with Rob and with Faye and the team, and you know, come to a position where you know, both sides are ultimately content with processing an audit adjustment or whatever. So, but we could, in theory, you know, raise that with the chair.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's just clear to you know, helpful to emphasise we continue to work really closely. There's an ongoing dialogue between, you know, ourselves and the team from Grant Thornton. So if something is identified, we'll raise it with them, or, you know, they'll discuss it with us, or if they identify something, they'll raise it with us, and we'll have that conversation. So so there will be things that will come up, especially, like you say, with the valuations, because it's based on assumptions, it's based on things at that point in time. So there will be things that we will be discussing. But in terms of the approach that we've always taken is to adjust the accounts, come to an agreement, and make sure that we hit that deadline in terms of signing them off, because that's always been really, really key to us, that we hit that, we get our accounts done, they're high quality, and we hit that deadline. So we will continue to work closely, and we'll keep obviously the Councillor White and Councillor Bluff informed, and that can extend wider if needed, if there is something that does materialise before that date.
Just a question from me regarding the airport. How does that impact the accounts this year? And if you just can explain where that appears and how it's impacted it.
So I'll start, and then Rob can chip in if needed. The main thing we've had to consider is the value to be included in the accounts, obviously. So in terms of valuing that, there is a requirement that it's you know, technically how we need to value. That is one of the areas that we're still having a look at, and we're still, you know, progressing that valuation. So that is one of the things we continue to liaise closely with Grant Thornton on, but that's where it impacts.
Yeah, nothing to add other than that, yes, it's on our balance sheet because it's one of our assets, and the main contention will be the valuation. Obviously, we put valuation in at a point in time, but we're ongoing in terms of whether that's the best valuation or not. So.
And have we had to account for the potential cost long term as well as valuing what we've got? Are we having to account for the potential liability of it?
It's a specialist area in terms of valuation, and we've been out to the market to get value of about a fair basis on which it's valued. We're sort of riding two horses at the moment in that regard. We've got a company that is assessing it, but we're in discussions with the district valuer as well. So we will be, as I say, in order to get, as Faye says, it's in the accounts, it's been valued, and we're alive to the fact that depending on where we get to in terms of the procurement process, this is going to be an ongoing and developmental area, because the lens you will look through will be very different in terms of the value about where we are in relation to the long-term lease that we have. So I think it's fair to say, with our experience, we've learnt loads in terms of the airport, but this is another developmental area we've also come into. From a value point of view, it's a highly complicated. I think it's a dark art myself. And if you want to go into a new career, that's the one to go into, because it's like whatever, you ask one set of valuers one thing and another, but and they approach it differently as well. So yeah, we've taken a view where we've got to at the moment. We've engaged with external agents in order to support us, and we'll get up to a point, and then it'll probably be adjusted. That will be an item that's adjusted in the accounts.
Thanks, Chair. Just to add to Debbie's comments there. So the sort of dark arts of valuations approaches. Obviously, finance colleagues, that they're not experts in valuation, hence why they employ a management expert valuer. Equally, we're not valuation experts, and on our larger, higher profile audits, such as Doncaster, for the last 5 years now, we've engaged our own auditor's valuation expert, so that they will sense check and challenge the council's valuer on the valuation, not just of the airport, but of your overall land and buildings, any other properties, your schools, etc. Because there is such a focus on ensuring that those are valued on a materially accurate basis, in order that I can give a clean opinion and satisfy our regulators. So that there's a lot of moving parts to this, as Debbie rightly commented.
I'll tell you an anecdote about finding SMEs later. Faye.
I think just to highlight Garrett's earlier comment, if the valuation does change, it doesn't hit the bottom line. So it's a figure in the accounts at a point in time. So I just wanted to highlight that as well. And in terms of the profit and loss, obviously the costs to the end of March were included, but it was for a smaller period.
Okay. Last question on me on the accounts. It's actually to Gareth, I think. So DSG, in terms, obviously it's a big number, but we had a fantastic presentation and training from Faye and the team earlier this week for all members, as Peter mentioned. The action plan is in place here. It seems to be working. The number is less now for the future for 2027 than it was going to be, but it's still an increasing number. It's just, and actually, I think I've calculated this right. I tried to find the numbers, but I think the rate of increase is still increasing. Yes, yeah, the in-year deficit is. So, yes.
So it's not 5%, though, it's 4.5%.
No, I don't think it is. I'll go back to the numbers, but I don't. I thought that, and I don't think it is. If I can find the numbers, I'll pull it out. But I worked out the percentage increase. I think it is actually still accelerating because of the demographic growth. But I'll come back to it on a later one. But how do we compare to other authorities of a similar size?
Yeah, good question, Chair. So I think we touched on this. Well, we've touched on this a few times, haven't we, in this committee? And I think particularly at the previous meeting back in April. So when the previous PSAA contract commenced in financial year 18-19, bearing in mind that GT's got roughly 40% of the local government market, there were 3 single-tier councils in a material deficit DSG position in 18-19, one of which is not too far from this organisation. You fast forwarded to 22-23, so year 5 of that original audit contract. That number had increased significantly to a point where it was unusual for a single tier council not to be in a material deficit position on its DSG. So I would say that, you know, your financial challenges on DSG are in line with the rest of the sector, and certainly the client base that I'm familiar with, and other organisations who perhaps got into a more difficult financial position on DSG earlier have now been subject to safety valve support in effect from central government to try and offset some of those deficits, whereas because you were, I suppose, in a better financial position than most later in the day, you know, I know that you've had some support and engagement with DFE, but you're not part of the safety valve agreement like others are, which makes your position, you know, even more challenging than some peer authorities, shall we say. So it is you know, an area for us to continue to focus on. Obviously, we've highlighted it in the VFM report the last couple of years, and indeed in the report in 22-23. We'll be looking at the arrangements that the council have had around DSG in 23-24 and form a view as to whether you know, we still believe it needs to be in as a key recommendation or not when we present our VFM report later this year.
Thanks very much, Gareth. Any additional questions? No. Thank you very much for your presentations and for your comments, Faye, Debbie as well. So I'll now read out the recommendations within the report. So the committee is asked to note the 2023 unaudited statement of account and review and be satisfied with the responses in the informing the audit risk assessment for the City of Doncaster Council 23-24 report. Was that moved? Seconded? Agreed. The recommendations are agreed, and I think I'm right in saying that concludes our business for today and today's agenda for the Audit Committee. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.